Hi, and welcome to The Greatest Lies in History, a riveting podcast that dives deep into the world of con artists who manipulated historical narratives to their advantage. I'm your host, Kimberly Desmond.
And I am your co-host, Patrick Pichler. We are two history students from Vienna with a love for all things that deal with historical scandals and controversy. Each episode of this podcast unpacks the integrated schemes, the psychology behind deception, and the consequences of these fabrications in our understanding of history. It explores how lies can shape societies, influence politics, and even alter the course of history itself.
Can you believe it? This is already our fifth and therefore our last episode. For one last time, we will look at one of the greatest lies in history and how it has shaped not only historical understandings, but also a whole nation refusing to come to terms with its problematic past.
Time really flies, Kimberly, doesn't it? At the end of the episode, we will also provide you with a throwback and a recap of all the lies that we have examined during this season and how they have affected society. But before that, let us talk about the historical lie for one last time.
If you've spent any time learning about post-war Austria, you've probably encountered the iconic image of the Trümmerfrauen. These strong, resilient women are often depicted clearing rubble and rebuilding cities and shaping the future of a war-torn nation. It's a tale of courage, patriotism, and self-sacrifice, a shining example of the national pride. But what if we told you that this story is, at best, heavily exaggerated, and at worst, an intentional revision of history designed to obscure the most uncomfortable truths of post-war Austria?
That's exactly what we are going to investigate in this episode today. The myth of the Trümmerfrauen has been used for decades to portray Austrian women as the unsung heroes of post-war recovery. But in reality, the truth is far more complicated, and much more politically charged indeed. By the end of this episode, we'll show you how this myth has been co-opted by Austria's far-right Freedom Party, FPÖ for short, and how monuments of the Trümmerfrauen, like the one in Vienna, have become not just tributes to the past, but also symbols in the battle for Austria's political future. These monuments are more than just reminders of history, they are deeply problematic and serve as vehicles for a much broader political agenda.
Let's start by setting the stage. In the wake of the Second World War, Austria, particularly Vienna, lay in ruins. The city had been heavily bombed during the war, and many buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. While the destruction in Austria wasn't as extreme as in our neighboring country Germany, the task of rebuilding it was still immense. The labor required to clear away debris and reconstruct the infrastructure fell to many hands, including women. However, the Trümmerfrauen myth presents these women as voluntary heroes working together out of sense and out of patriotic duty to rebuild their shattered homeland.
But the reality was much grimmer. The rubble clearance work wasn't some kind of heroic voluntary act, it was often a matter of obligation and punishment. Most women, along with former Nazis, prisoners of war, and other forced labourers, were conscripted into this arduous labour. Those women were often collaborators and were forced to work as a punishment for the participation in the horrific crimes of the Third Reich or a membership in the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, or Nazi Party for short. They were forced to clear the rubble by the tribunals of the Allied forces, which consisted of the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It was also a task that was looked down upon. It was considered shameful because it indicated clear ties with the Nazis. There is quite a famous picture of post-war Austria, portraying Trümmerfrauen working on the street, and there's a man passing by who looks at them with nothing but pure disgust.
The glorified narrative of women banding together, united in solidarity and duty, simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. While many women certainly worked hard and contributed to the reconstruction effort, the myth surrounding the Trümmerfrauen had been shaped and distorted over time to create an image of heroism that wasn't entirely accurate. The real story is one of hardship and necessity, and not national pride.
Well, interestingly, the origins of the Trümmerfrauen myth are not even entirely located in Austria. The glorification of women serving as symbols of resilience was actually rooted in the east of Germany, the German Democratic Republic. Under the new established communist regime, the narrative of the Trümmerfrauen was used to highlight the contribution of women in the collective labor force and thereby to emphasize the values of socialism. In East Germany, where rebuilding the country was a matter of political significance, the image of women clearing rubble was promoted as a symbol of the work state. Over time, the story spread westward, eventually finding its place in Austria's post-war identity.
Exactly, and let's not forget that Austria, in the aftermath of the Second World War, sought to portray itself as the first victim of Nazi aggression. Now bear with me. This narrative of victimhood has been incredibly important to Austria's national identity, leading to the refusal of paying reparations to the victims of the Holocaust and taking on the historical responsibility. This myth of the first victim only started to break away in the 1980s, when a presidential candidate was revealed to be a former member of the SA, Kurt Waldheim. He first served as a general secretary of the United Nations in New York. While he published an autobiography, he conveniently left out the years between 1938 and 1945, just stating that he was injured on the front lines and returned home. Only when he ran for presidency, his past was uncovered. Despite the revealing truth, he was still elected president. And his presidency not only had international consequences for Austria, but it also started to awaken at least some of the Austrian citizens. They started to protest, demanding Austria's past to be portrayed correctly and just for the victims. Of course, this didn't go over smoothly. Many people were still holding on to this narrative either to protect themselves, their family members, or the idea of national pride. This means that the counter-narrative had to be established. And a welcoming on was this idea of Trümmerfrauen. By focusing on the image of women heroically rebuilding their country, the Trümmerfrauen myth helped distract from Austria's own role in the atrocities of the Third Reich. It allowed the country to distance itself from the past, and instead, the myth emphasized a narrative of post-war recovery, innocence, and prosperity.
This is where the far-right Austrian Freedom Party, or FPÖ, comes into play. Over the years, the FPÖ has used the Trümmerfrauen myth to push a revisionist agenda, thereby reshaping Austria's history to fit their own political narrative. The party has a long history of downplaying the past of Austria during the time of Nazi occupation, and emphasized the idea that Austria was nothing more than a victim and not a perpetrator during the Second World War. By celebrating the Trümmerfrauen, the FPÖ taps into a narrative of national redemption, where the emphasis is placed on the contributions of ordinary Austrians, particularly women, to rebuild the country, rather than on the moral and historical complexities of Austria's role in the Second World War.
This narrative became prominent in 2018 when the FPÖ unveiled a controversial monument in Vienna dedicated to these Trümmerfrauen. The bronze statue depicts a woman holding a piece of rubble surrounded by inscriptions glorifying their efforts. On the surface, it looks like a simple tribute to hardworking women who helped rebuild the country. But when you look closer, it becomes evident that the monument isn't just about celebrating history. It's about reshaping how we as a society think of the past.
Let's break this down a little bit further, Kimberly. The FPÖ's Trümmerfrauen monument doesn't just celebrate the contributions of women to post-war reconstruction works. It also serves as a tool in their broader political campaign to rewrite the history of Austria itself. By focusing on the efforts of the Trümmerfrauen, the monument shifts attention away from the darker aspects of Austria's past, including its complicity in the Holocaust and its role as a collaborator in the crimes committed by the National Socialists. It perpetuates the idea that Austria was a nation of victims rather than one of perpetrators.
And there's an even more uncomfortable truth that the monument conveniently ignores. Many of the women who participated in rubble clearance were in fact former Nazis. In the immediate post-war period, clearing rubble was one of the tasks assigned to individuals undergoing denazification. But the myth of the Trümmerfrauen as unblemished heroes conveniently erases the fact that many of these women had been active supporters or even perpetrators of Nazi ideology. By presenting them as pure heroines, the monument demolishes this complicated history and ignores the role of former Nazis in the post-war reconstruction process.
This is why the monument has sparked so much controversy. Critics argue that it isn't simply a tribute to the women of post-war Austria. It's a political statement by the FPÖ, one that seeks to reframe Austria's history in a way that absolves the country of its past mistakes. The monument is a part of a broader trend of historical revisionism that seeks to portray Austria as a victim rather than a perpetrator, and with it to downplay the complexities of its role in the time of the Third Reich.
And the consequences of this revisionism are far-reaching. When myths like the Trümmerfrauen narrative are allowed to flourish unchecked, they shape our understanding of history, not just in Austria, but across the world. And these myths can influence political discourses, they can distort public perception, and they can prevent us from facing uncomfortable truths about our past. By celebrating a sanitized version of the past, we risk ignoring the complexities and contradictions that are necessary for meaningful reflections and growth.
Very well said indeed, Kimberly. So there is one central question left. What's the real story of Austrian women in the aftermath of the Second World War?
Well, it's a story of struggle, a story of survival and survival under extremely difficult conditions. Yes, women worked hard to rebuild their homes and families, but they did so out of necessity. Many faced food shortages, displacement, and the trauma of war. Their contributions were not born from a grand sense of national duty, but from the need to survive in a world that had been torn apart by violence and devastation.
And that is the real story that deserves recognition. The Trümmerfrauen myth, as it is often told, is a convenient fiction that absolves Austria of its complicity in Nazi crimes and elevates a selective version of history. It's important to recognize the contributions of Austrian women in the post-war period, but not at the expense of the truth.
You're right about that. The Trümmerfrauen myth is a powerful reminder of how myths can be used to shape our understanding of the past, and how those myths can be used as tools of manipulation. As citizens and as students of history, it's our responsibility to question these narratives, to dig deeper, and to uncover the full story. History is not just about celebrating the past, it's about understanding it in all its complexities, in all its contradictions, and yes, in all its uncomfortable truths.
Very well said, Kimberly. Now, I think we should start with our recap, don't we?
Let's dive right into it with our first episode where we introduced you to Sir Edmund Backhouse, the British con artist who manipulated perceptions of Empress Dowager Cixi in China under the Empress Dowager. Backhouse's forgery of the infamous Qing Shan diary influenced Western views on Chinese history for decades. This so-called diary painted Cixi as a manipulative, power-hungry leader, a characterization that fed into existing Western stereotypes about China as an exotic and corrupt empire. Backhouse's forgery wasn't just about personal gain, it reflected the biases and the colonial attitudes of the time, showing how lies can align perfectly with cultural narratives to gain credibility.
What made the story particularly compelling was the sheer audacity of Backhouse's claims. He didn't just fabricate minor details, he invented an entire historical source that shaped academic work for decades. His forgery shows how one person's deceit can ripple outward, impacting perceptions of an entire culture. It also highlights the danger of scholars and journalists rushing to embrace convenient narratives without proper scrutiny, doesn't it?
You're right about that. Moving on to episode 2, where we also looked at forged diaries. We dived into the incredible tale of the Hitler diaries. Here we encountered Konrad Kujau, a German forger whose counterfeit diaries of Adolf Hitler caused an international scandal. Kujau's ability to mimic Hitler's handwriting and immerse himself in the dictator's style of writing was absolutely astonishing. But what really propelled this hoax into the spotlight was the journalist Gerd Heidemann, whose obsession with Nazi-era memorabilia clouded his judgment. He convinced the German magazine Stern to purchase the diaries for millions, and other publications like the Sunday Times joined the frenzy.
This episode wasn't just about the forgery itself, it was also about the cultural fascination with Hitler and the Third Reich that made such a scam even possible. The diaries promised to reveal intimate details about one of history's most infamous figures, and in their rush to publish, media outlets ignored glaring red flags. For example, the paper and ink used in the diaries were clearly modern, and the content was oddly mundane for such an allegedly historic find. Yet, the desire for sensationalism overrode caution. The shitstorm from the scandal was massive, tarnishing reputations, nearly bankrupting Stern, and landing both Kuyau and Heidemann in prison.
Episodes like this remind us that history is often shaped not just by facts, but by the stories we're willing to believe. The Hitler Diary scandals also expose the perils of sensational journalism and the importance of rigorous fact-checking, lessons that are very relevant still today.
That brings us to the third episode, during which we traveled back to revolutionary France and dissected the infamous line, "Let them eat cake," attributed to the former queen Marie Antoinette. This phrase has become synonymous with aristocratic indifferences and arrogance, but as we uncovered, there's no evidence that the queen ever uttered those words. In fact, the phrase appeared in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writings long before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France. So, why was it attached to her?
Well, the answer lies in misogyny and xenophobia of the time. Marie Antoinette, an Austrian princess, was an easy target for revolutionary propaganda. She was portrayed as a symbol of excess and corruption, even though much of her supposed extravagance was exaggerated or fabricated. The affair of the diamond necklace further cemented her image as a reckless spendthrift. Revolutionary pamphlets and cartoons painted her as a foreign manipulator, undermining Louis XVI and plotting against the French people.
What's fascinating is how this narrative of the Queen's cullishness became a tool for justifying revolutionary action. The demonization of Marie Antoinette wasn't just about her as an individual. It reflected broader societal anxieties about foreign influence and the role of women in power. By blaming her for France's woes and the murderous turmoil, revolutionaries could rally the public against the monarchy while reinforcing patriarchal norms.
I gotta say that episode was definitely my favorite. Moving on to episode 4, where we explored the enduring legend of Anastasia Romanova, the youngest daughter of the Tsar Nicholas II. The myth that Anastasia survived the Bolshevik execution of the Romanovs captivated the public for decades, fueled by imposters like Anna Anderson and popular culture, including the 1997 animated Disney film.
And despite overwhelming forensic evidence debunking the survival myth, including DNA tests officially confirming the identities of the Romanov remains, the story persists to that day. You all may ask yourselves, why is that? Well, partly because it taps into our love for fairy tale endings. The idea that one innocent child could escape a brutal fate offers a glimmer of hope in an otherwise tragic narrative.
This episode also highlighted how incomplete or suppressed evidence can create fertile ground for conspiracy theories. During the Soviet era, the lack of transparency about the Romanovs' fate allowed rumors to flourish. Even after the remains were discovered and tested, the legend of Anastasia endured, showing us how deeply myths can be embedded in our cultural consciousness.
And this brings us to our fifth and final episode, where we shifted our focus to post-war Austria and the myth of the so-called Trümmerfrauen, women who supposedly heroically rebuilt the country from the rubble. While the image of the Trümmerfrauen has been celebrated as a symbol of resilience and patriotism, the reality is far more complex. Many of these women were conscripted laborers, including former Nazis and collaborators, working under Allied orders as part of a denazification process.
The glorified narrative of the Trümmerfrauen was later co-opted by Austria's far-right Freedom Party, or short FPÖ, to bolster a revisionist view of history. By celebrating these women as selfless patriots, the FPÖ sought to distract from Austria's complicity in Nazi crimes and reinforce the myth of Austria as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The construction of monuments such as the Trümmerfrauen complete with politically charged inspiration and shows how historical myths can be weaponized for contemporary agendas.
The episode underscored the power of historical memory and the ways in which myths can be used to reshape national identity. It's a cautionary tale about the need to critically examine the narratives we celebrate and the motives that lie behind them.
And just like that, the first season of The Greatest Lies in History is finished. So what ties all these episodes together? Well, at their core, they're about the power of storytelling and the consequences when those stories are built on lies. Whether it's a forged diary, a misattributed quote, or a romanticized escape, these stories reveal how easily myths can overshadow facts. They also show how these myths can often serve larger agendas, from colonial propaganda to nationalist revisionism.
Another recurring theme is the human desire to believe in extraordinary tales, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. These stories endure because they resonate on an emotional level, offering us villains to blame, heroes to admire, or hope to cling to.
As history students, we've learned that questioning the stories we're told isn't just important, it's essential. Myths often contain kernels of the truth, but they can also distort our understanding of the past and influence how we see the present.
Before we wrap up, it's very important to make one thing very clear. History isn't static. It's a living, evolving narrative shaped by the stories we choose to tell and believe. By critically examining those stories, we can uncover deeper truths and challenge the biases that shape our world today.
Well said, Patrick, and with that, we officially close the chapter on the greatest lies in history. Thank you to everyone who joined us on this journey. Your curiosity and engagement have made this series unforgettable.
Yes, thank you to you all. Don't forget to follow us on social media for updates and sneak peeks of future projects. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and always remember, history is rarely as simple as it seems.